Welcome to Niche Conversations. I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am lucky to be joined by Crystal Gail Fraser and Jess Dunkin. Do you want to tell us more about yourselves?
Sure. Well, Dringwinzi, Shillicut, Shori, Crystal, Vilji, Anuvik, Atdechan, Chogenjik, Gwitsak, Gwitchik, Gwitchin, Ithli. That was just hi, friends and relatives and colleagues. My name is Crystal. I am Gwitchia Gwitchin, originally from Anuvik, but calling from beautiful Treaty 6, where I live and work at the University of Alberta as an associate professor in history and Native studies.
Wonderful. And Jess?
I'm the other JD, who's an environmental historian.
Yes.
I always like chatting to Jessica DeWitt because we have the same initials.
Yep.
So thanks so much for having me. I'm joining the call from Sambake, which is also known as Yellowknife in Treaty 8 territory on Yellowknife's Dene land. I am a settler, historian, writer, researcher. I've lived here for a decade, and before that, I called Eastern Ontario home. That's where I was born and raised on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory.
Wonderful. And we have your 3-part series of moving up there, right? So if anyone wants to read about your road trip on your move up to northern Canada, you can do so. Thank you both for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about the How I Survive podcast. So I thought we could start off just by talking about what is this podcast and what unique roles did each of you play with the podcast?
Yeah, thanks. Well, maybe I will go first. So the How I Survived project and podcast is really a collaboration between the Northwest Territories Recreation and Parks Association and myself at the University of Alberta. We started this as a result of a conference presentation in 2017 in Anuvik, and it was very clear that more attention needed to be paid not only to the history of Indian Day in residential schools, but also to the bigger project of truth and reconciliation in this country. We're now in the 10th anniversary of the 94 calls to action, so a lot of projects are still ongoing, but this is a very apt time to renew our commitment to this really important work. And a part of that is engaging in a community engaged and community-based research project that allows us to work with survivors, but also to learn about history in ways that contribute to ongoing cultural revitalization and the transmission of knowledge. And so we have chosen storytelling as a method to explore that. And in particular, the project is meant to be survivor centric, and really what we hear time again is that even though these histories are very hard and traumatic and part of a larger system of genocide in Canada, we also hear that all of the focus can't just be on the damage. And so through the history of sport and recreation, we really seek to amplify survivors' voices, stories, knowledge, strength, and spirit. So I'm one of the co-leads on the project, along with Jess, and I'm also the research advisor for the project.
Okay. And Jess, what role did you play?
Yeah. So I realized in my introduction I didn't actually mention, so Crystal is sort of here on behalf of herself, obviously, but is connected with the University of Alberta. And I have been co-leading this project on behalf of the NWT Recreation and Parks Association, which is a nonprofit that's headquartered in Yellowknife, but which works across the territory. And so I am the project manager for the project, so doing a lot of the kind of day-to-day work on the project. the podcast, I'm a producer and also an editor. So as the producer, I've sort of shepherded each episode from interview to release. And then I've also done audio editing on the interviews, and also worked with Crystal and our research assistant, Rebecca Gray, on drafting scripts, and developing other materials. We have a website for the podcast, and so developing supporting materials for that as well. And so I'll just mention one more thing. So that's my role. But thus far, we just have one season of the podcast, 7 episodes. The first episode provides listeners with an introduction to the project, an introduction to the podcast. But it also provides an overview of the history of residential and day schooling in the North, and also a bit of a understanding of how recreation was a part of that history, as context for listeners, so that when they get into the rest of the episodes, of which there are 6, each one is focuses on a different survivor's story. Then they have I guess a bit of a foundation. They're not just sort of stepping off into the stories. And each story is a mix of an interview, but also some narration that helps to provide context for pieces that people might not be familiar with. So that's where we're drawing, again, also on survivor testimony and stories, but also on archival research in order to help further contextualize and enrich the understanding of listeners.
Brilliant. Okay. So you touched upon it, Crystal, but I wonder if we could go more in depth on understanding how a focus on recreation illuminates new ways of understanding residential and day school history in Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, that word recreation has so many meanings, and we've definitely explored some of those in the bigger project. But when we think about sport and recreation, especially in the context of it as this Euro-Canadian project of assimilation through schooling, we think about things like sports. We think about things like student clubs, like Scouts and Girl Guides, but also things like music and poetry and artwork. All of those things were taught at these residential schools to Indigenous children. And in particular, like with a few exceptions, historians in Canada have mostly focused on residential schools, rightly so, as a way of oppression and discipline and religion and assimilation. That kind of work is still very much needed, but a part of what sets How I Survived apart from other projects is that we were continually reminded about the complexity of survivors' experiences and strength-based narratives. And so even having said that, though, sport and recreation do fit under this category of civilizing Indigenous peoples, of assimilating them, of shaping their bodies and their behavior in a particular way. And so really it was a part of the bigger picture to not only reshape identities, but to also eliminate Indigenous forms of identities. But as I mentioned, it was also a site of resistance and survival. The folks that we worked with consistently told us that sport and recreation were a big part of their experience, and they often recall memories of singing and skiing and sewing and using sport and recreation as a way to leave the residential school and get back out on the land to reconnect with certain things that felt very natural and dear to them and a part of their culture. And that really brought some joy and freedom to an otherwise very carceral time in their life. And so even within these colonial institutions, youth did find a way to exercise resistance and culture. So I mean, the thing with trying to do this work with people who are still healing from these traumatic histories is being very sensitive to the kinds of things that people want to talk about. And we have found that a lot of people want to talk about sport and recreation. Like, nobody wants to be defined by these really awful moments, but they can bring joy to these harder memories. And in the larger project, we have also talked about that this kind of approach is actually shifting how we think about truth and reconciliation. So better understanding sport and recreation and its history and how it's connected to the land is really starting to transition us to wellness, cultural revitalization, and relationship building.
Beautiful. Yeah, and those I've listened to 5 out of 7 episodes, I think, and all of these themes that you're talking about really do come to the forefront. It's so valuable to listen to these firsthand accounts and really, just immerse yourself in and listen to the storytelling and listen to the personal experiences. And yeah, it's everyone should listen to the podcast. That's great. So
Can I just,
NiCHE, of course. So, go ahead, Jess.
I was just, that's such a wonderful affirmation of this project, because when we started Crystal said the seed for this project was in 2017, but we started meeting as an advisory committee in 2018. And the initial plan was to do a traveling exhibit.
Oh, okay.
And 2 years ago, the advisory committee met and made a total about face, and we're like, a traveling exhibit would be great, but really we think that we should make a podcast. And it was for all of the reasons that you just said, is they wanted people to hear from survivors telling their stories in their own words. There is an intimacy to putting on a set of headphones, and just like filling your ears with someone's experiences, with their voice, with the moments when they laugh, when they have to pause, when they cry. I mean, the interviews are all, emotional roller coaster isn't quite the right word, but there's so much happening in them. There are moments of joy, there are moments of intense pain, there's moments of anger, of frustration, of hope, of all the things. So I think that comes through in a podcast in a way that I don't think it would have in an exhibit. So I'm glad that lands for you as a listener as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. All those things that you said. And I think I don't always, I'm not an audio, like an oral, I don't listen, I don't learn well through listening and audio and stuff. I'm more of a visual person. But that is not when it's personal narratives. When it's like firsthand accounts and stuff, it kind of changes. I think it really draws me in a way that sometimes just listening to, I can't do audiobooks or something. So I think it's really powerful. Of course, everyone learns differently, and some people learn very well through audiobooks and that sort of thing. So, but just to say that as someone who isn't audio inclined, I still found it really engaging. It really drew me in. So we are NiCHE, of course, and for our site, you kind of wrote a post that highlights connections to land and the environment. So I thought maybe we could wrap up today by kind of drawing that out. And, can you tell us how the podcast connects the history of this recreation to the land and environment?
Yeah, it was funny. I remember when we got the invitation to submit something to the NiCHE blog, both Crystal and I were a little bit surprised. And I think that's largely because most environmental historians have not, or there's not a lot of environmental history writing on residential and day schooling.
Yes.
And so, obviously residential and day schools were our environmental history. Jocelyn Thorpe wrote that on the NiCHE site in 2016, because their primary goal was to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands, and to disconnect them from the knowledge and the skills and the strength that they and the language and everything that sort of is grounded in the land. So clearly these are there is such an obvious connection, and that comes out in the archive, in the kinds of things that administrators and bureaucrats were talking about in terms of setting up this system, and setting up these institutions. But it's also very apparent in all of the interviews that we conducted. So time and again, people talk about being taken from their families, being taken from their territories, often to places that didn't look anything like the lands that they knew and loved and were home to them. They talk about the loss of language, the loss of connection to land, the loss of skills and knowledge that, meant survival, and not just survival, but thriving on the land. And then they talk about oftentimes the work of rebuilding those relationships, of relearning their languages, relearning the knowledge and skills that would allow them to thrive on the land. And so clearly there are many important connections between residential schooling, environmental history, histories of land. Recreation offers us yet another lens and another layer to kind of understand the complexity of these various intertwining histories. So Crystal talked a little bit about how, recreation reshaped how children moved their bodies, how they understood their bodies and themselves, how they interacted with other children. And they also reshaped how they saw and understood and experienced the land. And that's most evident in, outdoor activities. So through something like skiing or hockey, the land becomes a site of competition or a place for training, those kinds of things. And that's a different way of thinking about land than land as relation or land as a source of language, of governance, of spirituality, of sustenance. So these are really vital connections and then disruptions that happen as a result of residential school and recreation. But recreation, again, as Crystal noted, is also a form of resistance. Paul Andrew, who's one of the hosts and is also a member of our advisory committee, talks about how even though the landscape that he was skiing through in Inuvik was very different than the territory of the Shuta-Gotine, the nation that he's from, it still had that connection to home. He was still outside, amongst the trees, under the sky, moving across the land, moving his body in a way that recalled home. Sharon Firth talks about the same thing with skiing.
Yep.
And that's sort of within the context of formal recreation, but there's also, really beautiful memories of how informal recreation also provided that ongoing connection. So Dave Poitras, who's from Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, he talks about how, they would be out skating, or they'd be out sliding on the hills. And those were ways that they felt at home on the land in a way that they didn't, when they were in the school building or in church or in classrooms or these kinds of things. And the other story that I always come back to, or other remembering that was really powerful for me, was with Agnes Kuptana. So she did the artwork for the podcast. She's our guest in episode 6, and she talks about how children would go and spend time outside together as a way to care for each other when they knew that someone was being abused or being bullied or experiencing something really traumatic. So then land-based activities become a form of care, which again is not something, I can't speak for Crystal, but that was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting to hear. So recreation invites as a lens through which to view residential school invites different ways of understanding that experience than, you know, a focus on another sort of aspect of that experience would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, am I able to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to backtrack a moment and just like really, really encourage more critical questioning about the relationship of residential schools to land and environment. Um, Jess mentioned, you know, that these calls have been made before. And I also know that Andrew Wolford, who I believe is a sociologist, has written about water in relation to residential schools. And so we also need to start thinking about residential schools as forced relocations, that Indigenous children were far removed from their communities for many years, sometimes thousands of kilometers. And there are very interesting survivor stories about what a different landscape looked. In particular, when somebody from like an Inuk child from the high Arctic, Eastern Arctic, arrived in a place with trees. So I think there's a lot of complexity there still to unpack. I was also going to say that like this is an interesting question because it is not necessarily one that would be asked in community. And the reason for that is because the connection and relationship and history and the treaties that we make with land are so central to ideology and how we live our lives and how we think about everyday things. And we also see that in some of the episodes in the podcast. Survivors talk about the land. They mention how it is so embedded in how they think, in what they do, in how they seek care and comfort, but also how they've thought about their life after residential school. I believe it was in episode 7 when we hear from Sharon Ann Firth, you know, a 4-time Olympian in cross country skiing, who credits her success to her athleticism from running her parents' trap line in a clavic when she was 5 years old. So, you know, having this ancestral and lived strength that is embodied in us as Indigenous peoples, you know, learning Euro-Canadian forms of sport and recreation. Those were not all happy stories, but also learning how this can connect to land and to the larger project of truth and reconciliation, cultural revitalization. And we actually saw a part of that at our advisory committee meeting in Yellowknife in April, where one of the things that we introduced at the advisory committee meeting this year was to have cultural activities as a part of the agenda. And so Lila Fraser Erasmus gave a talk about medicines that we can get from the land. She shared her knowledge for about an hour. And so not only using this project as a way to better understand survivors' experiences, but also as a way for somebody like me. I am not a residential school survivor. I am connected to my land and my culture, but this is also like a relearning process. And so acknowledging an intergenerational transmission of knowledge, acknowledging that residential schools were designed to stop this kind of knowledge and learnings and understandings. And so on the one hand, learning about the past, but then on the other hand, really paying close attention to the nation building aspect. How can we recover all of this really great knowledge about land and environment with the lens of sport and recreation?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I want to echo that. There's so much to be done in environmental history with residential schools. Like that Thorpe piece that Jess mentioned was 2016, so that's almost a decade ago. And then Tina Adcock and I tried to put together a list. I think it was 2020. And we had our time finding 5 things to put on a list of environmental contexts of residential schools. And I think that's absolutely appalling. And it hasn't improved that much since in the last 5 years. So I do have a colleague, Taryn Goff, who recently defended her master's at the University of Saskatchewan looking at gardens in residential schools. So, and how, these Indigenous kids were relocated and then forced to remake the landscape that they are taken to into, a British landscape. And then those were used to showcase the residential schools and kind of show them off and stuff. Anyways, it's a very interesting topic. So that's one instance, only one instance that I know of. So much work to do better environmental stories. But if you need, some background knowledge or some inspiration or turn to this podcast. There's so much in it, as we've discussed today. And I want to thank you both for working on this project. It's so valuable.
Quickly, can I ask Jess to share with the listeners how they find the podcast?
Yes, of course.
So the How I Survived podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also find us on our website and listen there. You can stream it there or link to the Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So that's howisurvived.ca. And I sent a little text to Crystal just before we hopped on the call saying we've had more than 1,400 downloads already, which for a little podcast from the Northwest Territories feels pretty exciting. So we're really appreciative of all of the people who have listened and shared the podcast with other people that you know. Feel free to do that, listeners or watchers of Instagram Lives.
Indeed. We'll be sharing this interview on YouTube as well. And I think you've mentioned that, if you find more people that are willing to be interviewed, like to do a second season or
So when we met in April in Yellowknife, the steering committee said they would very much like to see a second season. So stay tuned, over the coming year and beyond. And if anyone is listening who has a connection to a Northern Indian residential or day school, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you, Jess and Crystal, for joining me today. This was a really lovely chat, and thanks for your work.
Thanks.
Masicho.
Jessica.
Bye.
Masi. Bye.